Okay, so have you ever felt like you're kind of stuck in a relationship rut? Like you keep replaying the same patterns over and over, even when it's with different people?
Yeah. Or maybe you've been told you're too clingy or maybe too distant, and you just wonder if a truly good relationship is even possible for you.
Well, if that sounds familiar, you're in the right place because today we're going to do a deep dive into all of that.
Right. We're going to unpack attachment styles.
Mm,
Think of it like this. It's kind of the hidden wiring that shapes how you connect with others in your closest relationships.
yeah, and it's all about how those first bonds that you formed way back when you were a kid, those relationships with your caregivers, they really lay the groundwork for how you experience things like intimacy and trust and even vulnerability today as an adult.
It's powerful stuff.
It is. So before we go any further, let's just define what we mean by attachment theory. It can sound a little academic. What's the core idea here?
Well, attachment theory really focuses on how we as humans form those deep emotional bonds, and it really starts from when we're infants. So think about it as a baby. You are completely reliant on your caregivers, not just for the obvious things like food and shelter, but for feeling safe and secure.
Right. That deep need for safety and security is so essential, isn't it?
It is. And when caregivers respond consistently, when they're warm, when they tune into the needs of the baby, a powerful message gets through. It tells the baby the world is a safe place and relationships are a source of comfort.
But what happens when that early caregiving isn't so consistent?
Yeah, well, that's when things get really interesting. So let's say the caregiving is inconsistent, or maybe sometimes it's even threatening. The baby's brain, that incredible survival tool that it is, adapts to try to protect itself.
So those adaptations become the foundation for how we approach relationships as adults.
Exactly. So these ingrained patterns, these adaptations of how we relate to others and what we expect from those close relationships, those are what we call attachment styles.
And there are four main attachment styles, right?
You got it.
Okay, so as we describe each one, I really want you to think about what resonates with you. What feels familiar from your own relationships, or maybe even dynamics you've seen in other people's relationships. So first up, let's talk about secure attachment. This is what we all hope for, right? This is the healthy one.
It is. It's kind of the gold standard, if you will. And people with a secure attachment style, they generally feel really comfortable with both intimacy and independence. They can be close to others without feeling like they're losing themselves. They trust their partners, and they can communicate openly and effectively.
What kind of childhood experiences would lead to this secure attachment style?
If we look back, during childhood, these securely attached adults, they typically had caregivers who are consistently available and emotionally attuned to their needs. These caregivers, they really made the child feel safe and understood and valued.
So if you're securely attached as an adult, how does that show up in your relationships?
Well, you would likely see someone who doesn't play games. They don't need to manipulate. They're emotionally available and they're comfortable being vulnerable. They don't shy away from deep connection, and they can handle those inevitable disagreements or separations that come up in any relationship.
Give us a concrete example. Let's really paint a picture here.
Okay, so picture this. Your partner who has a secure attachment style. They tell you they need some time alone to recharge. Now, you might feel a little pang of, missing them, but your main response is going to be trust and open communication. So you might say something like, okay, I understand. Let's talk about it. When do you think you'll be ready to reconnect? There's no rush of anxiety. There's no accusations. You're just grounded and trusting.
Okay, that sounds pretty healthy. Now let's talk about anxious attachment. This is sometimes called preoccupied attachment, and it's a very different experience, isn't it?
It is. And if you have an anxious attachment style, you might feel a really deep longing for intimacy and closeness. But at the same time, there's this fear of rejection or abandonment. It can be a painful combination.
Yeah. So you're really craving that closeness, but terrified of losing it.
Yeah. And this often leads to needing a lot of reassurance from your partner and sometimes overanalyzing their words and actions, like always looking for signs that your fears are coming true. It's exhausting.
And what kind of early experiences might contribute to developing an anxious attachment style?
Often it comes from inconsistent caregiving. So maybe as a child, your caregivers were loving and attentive sometimes, but then other times they were distant or distracted, or maybe their responses to your needs felt really unpredictable. And that inconsistency can create this deep sense of uncertainty, this worry about whether your needs will be met consistently.
So as an adult, how does this anxious attachment play out in relationships?
Well, one thing you might notice is a heightened sensitivity to any sign of disconnection, anything that even hints at rejection. You might come across as needy or overly dependent on your partner, and you might spend a lot of time and energy overthinking communication. The timing of texts, the exact words they use, their tone of voice, anything to try and figure out if there's some hidden meaning or some threat to the relationship.
It sounds like a really difficult way to experience relationships always being on edge like that.
It can be.
So can you give us a specific example of what this might look like in real life?
Okay, so let's say you send a text to your partner and they don't respond right away. Maybe it's only been a few minutes, but for someone with an anxious attachment style, their mind might immediately jump to conclusions like, they're upset with me, they're losing interest, they must be talking to someone else. And that can trigger a whole wave of anxiety and maybe even lead to sending multiple texts just looking for that reassurance.
So it's like their nervous system is on high alert all the time, waiting for that other shoe to drop.
That's a really good way to put it.
Okay, let's move on to the next style. This is avoidant attachment, sometimes called dismissive avoidant. This one seems almost like the opposite of anxious attachment.
It is in a lot of ways. If you have an avoidant attachment style, you probably place a really high value on independence. You might prioritize your independence so much that you end up feeling emotionally detached in your relationships.
So it's like you need that distance.
Yeah. And
Right.
you might struggle with vulnerability, and you pull back when things start to feel too close or too intense emotionally.
So what leads to this avoidant attachment style? What happens in childhood?
Usually avoidant attachment develops when those early caregivers were emotionally distant or unavailable, or maybe they even rejected attempts at seeking comfort or connection. And so, as a child, you learn that it's not safe or effective to rely on others for emotional support, and you adapt by becoming very self-reliant and sometimes suppressing your own needs for closeness.
It makes sense you kind of learn to go it alone.
Yeah, and then as an adult, this plays out in romantic relationships by you keeping people at arm's length, avoiding those really deep emotional conversations, and maybe struggling with commitment. And then when conflicts arise or when the relationship starts to get more serious and intimate, you feel that urge to withdraw, to shut down emotionally, or even to end the relationship altogether.
Do you have an example that illustrates this avoidant pattern?
Yeah, so imagine you start dating someone, and at first you're really excited, you're enthusiastic. But then as the relationship progresses and you start to feel more connected, more intimate, suddenly you feel this discomfort, this urge to create distance. You might start saying you need more space, or that you're not ready for something serious, even though earlier on you seemed really invested. And, in some cases, this can lead to ghosting the other person.
And that can be really painful for the person on the receiving end of that. They're left wondering what happened. Now we need to talk about the fourth attachment style. This is fearful-avoidant attachment, sometimes called disorganized attachment. And this one can be the most complex and the most painful. What makes it so challenging?
Well, it's like this. If you have a fearful avoidance style, you really crave love and connection, just like someone with an anxious attachment style, but you're also terrified of intimacy and vulnerability, just like someone with an avoidant attachment style. It's almost like you have both styles within you, and it creates this push and pull dynamic.
So you want closeness, but you're also terrified of it.
Yeah, and this can make relationships really difficult, both for the person with this attachment style and for their partner.
So what causes this fearful avoidant attachment style to develop?
It usually comes from early childhood experiences of abuse or neglect, or maybe really severe and unpredictable emotional inconsistency from caregivers. So the people who should have been your source of safety and comfort were actually sources of fear or pain. And that creates this really difficult dilemma for a child, because they long for connection, but their experiences have taught them that getting close to others is dangerous.
That's a really tough position to be in.
It is, and it's something that a lot of people carry with them into adulthood.
So how does this play out in adult relationships? What are some of the signs of a fearful avoidant attachment style?
You might see what we call hot and cold behavior. So 1 minute the person might be expressing a lot of love and affection, talking about a future together, and then seemingly out of nowhere they become distant and unavailable or even hostile. And this could be really confusing for their partner. Trust is a huge issue, both trusting others and trusting their own feelings. And there can be a tendency to sabotage relationships or to stay in unhealthy relationships because that feels familiar even if it's painful.
So they're pulled in two different directions. They want connection, but they're also scared of it.
Exactly. And this internal conflict can manifest in all sorts of ways in their relationships.
Can you give us a real-life example of what this push and pull dynamic might look like?
Sure. So imagine you're with your partner, and one day you're expressing deep feelings of love and affection. You're talking about your future together, and then the next day, for no apparent reason, you withdraw completely. You stop responding to their messages, you create this emotional distance, and your partner is left completely confused and hurt. And it's not that you're doing this intentionally. It's that deep down, you're afraid that getting close will inevitably lead to pain.
So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Yeah.
You're so afraid of getting hurt that you end up pushing people away and causing the very pain you're trying to avoid.
Exactly.
It's so clear how these early childhood experiences can impact our relationships even years later. So when people with different attachment styles get together, are there any pairings that are more common than others?
Absolutely. So one really common dynamic you see is anxious attachment paired with avoidant attachment.
That seems counterintuitive. Why would people with those seemingly opposite styles be drawn to each other?
Well, if you think about it from the perspective of what felt familiar in childhood, it starts to make more sense. So for someone with an anxious attachment, pursuing an emotionally unavailable partner might unconsciously remind them of trying to get the attention and affection of a parent who was unpredictable. And for someone with an avoidant attachment, that anxious partner pursuing them might feel like a manageable level of validation without requiring them to be really emotionally engaged. It allows them to maintain some distance.
So it's like they're recreating the patterns they learned in childhood.
In a way, yes.
What about people with secure attachment? How do they tend to navigate relationships with people who have different attachment styles?
Well, if you have a secure attachment style, you often bring a very stabilizing and even healing presence to the relationship. Because you're comfortable with intimacy and you're good at communicating your needs, you can help to calm the anxieties of an anxiously attached partner, or gently encourage an avoidant partner to open up more over time. Now, of course, even secure individuals can face challenges in relationships with people who have very different attachment styles, but that secure base that you bring to the relationship can make a big difference.
It sounds like having a secure attachment style is a real asset in relationships.
It can be.
So as we've been talking, it's become clear that these attachment styles aren't just abstract concepts. They really show up in the day-to-day of our relationships. It influences how we handle disagreements, how we communicate, how comfortable we are with intimacy, and even how we deal with breakups.
That's right. Your attachment style shapes how you see your partner's actions, how you express your own needs, and how you cope with closeness and conflict. For example, if you have an anxious attachment style, your partner needing some alone time might feel like a huge rejection. But if you have an avoidant attachment style, a partner who wants more contact might feel really suffocating to you.
It's like we each have our own unique lens through which we're viewing the relationship.
Exactly.
And you mentioned earlier that these attachment styles that we develop early in life aren't necessarily permanent. Can we actually change our attachment style as adults?
Yes, you can. It's definitely possible, and it's something that a lot of people work on. We call this earned secure attachment, and it means that even if you didn't have that consistent secure attachment in childhood, you can still develop the traits and the relationship patterns of a secure attachment style. It takes effort, but it's definitely possible.
That's really good to hear. What are some of the ways that someone can work towards developing a more secure attachment style?
Well, there are a few key things that can help. First and foremost, it's important to develop self-awareness. Really understand your own attachment patterns and how they show up in your relationships.
So that's the first step, knowing your own patterns.
Right. And from there, therapy or coaching can be really valuable. They can give you insights and tools for change. And of course, having healthy and supportive relationships in your life can also be incredibly healing. It helps to rewrite those old scripts.
Yeah, it's like you're getting new experiences that challenge those old patterns.
And sometimes doing some inner child work could be really helpful to address those past wounds from childhood. Learning to set healthy boundaries and developing better emotional regulation skills are also really important.
So it's a journey.
It is.
Okay, so for our listeners out there who are recognizing some of these anxious or avoidant patterns in themselves, what are some specific things they can do starting today to move towards healing and building more secure relationships?
If you're noticing anxious patterns, one really good thing to practice is self-soothing techniques. So before you immediately reach out to your partner for reassurance, try to find healthy ways to manage your anxiety on your own. It can be as simple as taking some deep breaths, going for a walk, or journaling.
Those are great practical tips. What about for someone who's recognizing avoidant patterns?
If you tend towards avoidance, it can be really helpful to practice just sitting with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately withdrawing or shutting down. Allow yourself to feel those feelings, even if it's unpleasant, and try to gradually let people in a little bit closer, even if it feels a little scary at first. Journaling can also be really helpful to explore your fears around vulnerability and to understand where they're coming from.
So much of this is about getting to know yourself better, isn't it?
It is.
Are there any general pieces of advice that you would give to anyone, regardless of their attachment style, when it comes to building healthier relationships?
Definitely. One of the most important things is to learn to communicate your needs directly and clearly. Don't expect your partner to just know what you need. Tell them. And be mindful of the partners you choose. Look for people who feel emotionally safe and who are capable of healthy relating. And lastly, try to approach your own patterns and triggers with curiosity and self-compassion instead of judgment. Remember, these patterns developed for a reason. They were trying to protect you in some way.
So much of this is about shifting our perspective from blame to understanding.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into attachment styles, what's the most important message that you want our listeners to take away?
Your past experiences have shaped you, but they do not define you. Understanding your attachment style isn't about blaming yourself or your caregivers. It's about awareness. And that awareness is the first step to creating healthier and more fulfilling relationships.
I love that. It's like we've been following an old unconscious script in our love lives, and now we have the power to start rewriting that script.
That's a great way to put it.
So here's a little challenge for you this week as you go about your life. Pay attention to your reactions to closeness in your relationships. Notice if you tend to cling and seek reassurance, or if you tend to withdraw and shut down when things get more intimate. Just observe those tendencies with curiosity without judgment. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just information.
Information that can help you create the relationships you truly desire.
Exactly. And if this deep dive resonated with you, please share it with someone you think might benefit from it. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to send us a message and let us know what resonated with you. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And remember, building healthier relationships isn't about perfection. It's about showing up authentically and being aware of your patterns.
And celebrating every step you take in the right direction.
That's a great place to leave it. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
See you then.